know there are a lot of people who feel, they've heard enough about September 11, 2001 by October 24th, 2007. But I really feel we're just getting around to talking about the deeper meaning of so much that's happened in this country since then. On 9/11, individual Americans responded courageously, reasonably, but the nation as a whole responded in ways that, on reflection, are truly strange and disturbing and beg for explanation. Let me just give you a few quick examples of what I mean. You may remember that politicians and pundits at the time were spouting all kinds of vigilante rhetoric about how they would have to smoke them out of their holes or shoot them between the eyes. John Wayne kept coming up. There were all kinds of references to the war on terror being like a return to our Indian wars and back to, quote, taming the frontier. The media was also claiming that the attacks would bring back traditional family arrangements. Now, you may not remember all of this because so much of it just washed over us without any inspection. But there was this insistence at the time that 9/11 would bring about a marriage boom, a baby boom, a return to full-time domesticity. And even feminism was said to be deep-sixed by the attacks. I had an early warning of this last phenomenon, actually on the very afternoon of 9/11. A few hours after the towers fell, I got this phone call from a reporter who said he was doing a reaction story. He mostly seemed eager to tell me his reaction, which was, and I quote, "Well," he said, "this sure pushes feminism off the map." Now, this was all not only baffling, but not how other countries who have suffered terrorist attacks, like England or Spain, responded. It seemed peculiar to us as a nation. So tonight, I don't want to talk to you about what 9/11 did to Americans. I want to talk to you about what 9/11 revealed about America. Because I came to feel that underlying our reactions to September 11 was a cultural mythology that we've barely begun to reckon with. And it holds a key to a number of mysteries. For example, why is it when the hijackers had aimed the planes at the symbols of commercial and military power, were we acting as if they had targeted the American home and hearth? Why, when we've been attacked by men who hate Western women's liberation, were our pundits so eager to say that 9/11 had ushered in the end of feminism? Why, when we've been called on to fight a new kind of war in a global age, were our leaders reenacting a Wild West drama on the old frontier? Why, with all of the crises we had to deal with in this period, was there all this to do about the rescue of one quote-unquote girl, Private Jessica Lynch? I want to talk to you about all these aspects, but first I want to start with another question. And to answer it, I'm going to take us on a brief foray into American history. Perhaps the most mysterious of these contradictions was this one. We kept hearing over and over that these attacks were something that had never happened to us before. America, we kept hearing, is not a place that's vulnerable to assault on home soil. Now, in recent times, that's true. But if we actually consider America's real history, we realize something important. This has happened to us before, over and over. And its happening was essential to the formation of the American character. For the first 200 years, the main feature of colonial American life was being attacked on quote-unquote home soil. Now, granted, this was home soil that the settlers had taken from the native population. Nevertheless, from the settlers' point of view, what they experienced was being attacked by people they regarded and demonized as non-Christian, non-white, quote-unquote terrorists, a term that was actually employed at the time. These were attacks aimed at villages, communities. They were aimed at the home and hearth. These were also deeply traumatic attacks for both sides. King Philip's War, which began in 1675, was the formative confrontation between white settlers and the New England tribes. It stands to this day as, per capita, America's deadliest war. In 1 year, 1 of every 10 military men of military age in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was killed. 2/3 of New England towns were attacked. More than half of them were destroyed. Settlers were forced back nearly to the coast, and the society fell into what came to be known as, quote, the Great Crisis. Indian suffering and casualties were, of course, far worse. The bitterness unleashed on both sides would initiate a harrowing series of conflicts that would drag on well into the 18th century. Those conflicts reduced early American settlers to a state of perpetual insecurity, what frontier historian Richard Slotkin called an atmosphere of terror. So how did we as a nation respond in the years to come to this foundational experience? Largely by covering it up with the creation of a cultural myth. Beginning in the 18th century and culminating in the Victorian era, our culture, our journalists, politicians, novelists, artists, sculptors, concocted a fantasy that post-revolutionary America desperately wanted to believe, a myth of ourselves as triumphal rescuers, the myth of American invincibility. Now, in talking about this, I'm not talking about some sort of recovered memory syndrome. We didn't remember the original trauma on 9/11. Knowing how we are as a country, we barely remember what happened yesterday, unless it involves Britney Spears. But what I'm talking about is a tangible cultural heritage, a worldview whose instructions are handed down in everything from newspaper accounts to novels to movie scripts. Furthermore, I'm talking about a myth that doesn't necessarily belong to one sex or another. Men and women both believe in it. But thanks to its history, it has a gender aspect. Our early experience of terror was deeply humiliating to the settler community. Time and again, leaders, militias, husbands were not able to protect families in the frontier towns, nor to rescue them. Between the late 17th and early 18th century, more than a quarter of New England women who were taken captive were never rescued, and a whopping 60% of girls were never rescued. Male settlers suffered the further mortification of having to hear female captives denounce failed male efforts, or perhaps worse, announce how they, the women, had managed to defend themselves without male help. Mary Rowlandson, who wrote the most famous of the accounts of captivity, told how she negotiated shrewdly with her captors and negotiated her own ransom. Hannah Dustin, who was abducted from her home a few days after giving birth to her 12th child, abducted while her husband sort of ran in the door, saw the Indians coming and ran out, announced how she freed herself by killing 10 Indians. Not only that, actually scalping them because she hoped to get the bounty. These were the kind of accounts that got rewritten and rewritten until male shame had been turned into exaggerated, ironclad valor, and female strength had been derided and turned into exaggerated helplessness. Nathaniel Hawthorne, for instance, turned Hannah Dustin's husband Thomas from a skedaddler into a mighty hero on horseback who had dispatched with scores of Indians, a story he made up out of whole cloth, and turned Hannah Duston into a, quote, bloody old hag who should be expunged from the history books. And the women who weren't turned into hags were turned into these frail creatures in danger of rape unless they were rescued. And it's in this way that we ended up with Natty Bumppo in The Last of the Mohicans, Buffalo Bill, and all those dime store cowboy heroes rescuing helpless young women, all the way down to the modern era of movies, to John Wayne saving Little Debbie in the 1956 Western classic, The Searchers, to Tom Cruise saving his daughter from not only Martian attack, but a molester in Spielberg's Post-9/11 film and Post-9/11 informed film, War of the Worlds. The point is, this is a general myth of national character, but because of its origins, it relies on a formula based on male and female roles. The formula goes that the nation is strong because its men are brave and capable protectors. But men can't be shown to be brave and capable unless women are weak and in need of a male savior. So all that said, let me return us to September 11. On that day, you could say that we suffered two attacks. A physical attack that destroyed buildings and people, and a symbolic attack that shattered the American myth of invincibility. In response, we deployed some heavy artillery to repair the myth. How did we do this? By using a trumped-up domestic drama to paper over our vulnerability. Now, this expressed itself in a variety of ways, some of which were exceedingly frivolous and silly. Other ways were important and dangerous. So let me start with the silly. Look at some of the messages we were getting after 9/11. By the end of October 2001, I counted 4 articles in the New York Times alone that claimed that single career women were going to react to 9/11 by repenting their independence and rushing to the wedding altar. One of these articles actually advised women to take as their model the Twin Towers, which the magazine claimed were, the newspaper claimed were like a Mr. and Mrs. A, quote, long married couple caught up in a third-year romance. Now, single women who didn't hurry up and get married, the New York Times said, would be seen as, quote, out of sync with the country's renewed sense of purpose, small-minded, and, quote, unpatriotic. You could see this sort of line forming all over the media. News weeklies and newspapers predicted that 9/11 would take a deep mental toll on the unmarried because they'd have no one to call if their plane was hijacked. CBS's The Early Show summoned unwed women to the set to talk about the, quote, void you must now be feeling. Even the tabloid The Star published a special post-9/11 issue dedicated to Hollywood celebrities who were supposedly berating themselves for failing to commit sufficiently to family life. 9/11 was also supposedly driving women to the nursery. The press claimed that the attacks had set off women's biological clocks, that there would be a baby boom, and that women having babies was now women's, quote, patriotic duty. Women were also said to be responding to 9/11 by returning to full-time homemaking. The Los Angeles Times said that the shock of the attacks was, quote, pushing some of the country's best prepared career women towards stay-at-home motherhood, unquote. Time magazine predicted that women would stock up on meatloaf pans and sewing machines. Stay home, the magazine said, sew your own drapes and dresses. TV programmers announced that in 2002, the new shows for the, quote, post-9/11 inspired season, unquote, would be dramas about, guess what, women returning to the home, often set in 1950s domestic scenes. And the fashion industry promoted what it called crisis couture, which would be all about chiffon, baby doll dresses, and Victorian white lace. Women, Vogue magazine told us, would now want outfits that were, quote, distinctively non-aggressive and no longer, quote, about dominance and power. Well, there was a tremendous amount of this silliness, but it also had a serious side. Right after the attacks, there were an alarming number of articles and commentaries accusing women, specifically feminists, of weakening our military, undermining our resolve to fight, and exhibiting traitorous behavior. Many feminist critics were vilified in extremely ugly ways. And more generally, women's voices began disappearing from op-ed pages and news talk shows. In the first 7 weeks following the attacks, the number of women guests on those important Sunday morning talk shows, news programs, shrank by 40%. Even women who were heads of congressional subcommittees dealing with terrorism, like Senators Feinstein and Boxer, made no appearances on these shows. Now, while women were being shrunk, men were being inflated. Our male political leaders were reimagined as superheroes and powerlifters. The media called Bush approvingly our Lone Ranger, Top Gun, Superman, Bullet Man, and America's Dragon Slayer. Newsweek assured us that we should feel safe because Bush is, quote, a fighting machine who has dropped 15 pounds and cut his time in the mile to 7 minutes. Vanity Fair ran a cover story photo essay describing Bush and his cabinet as, quote, the Magnificent Seven. And the article assigned raw-knuckled nicknames to each of Bush's men. So Cheney became The Rock, Ashcroft was dubbed The Heat, and Tom Ridge was The Protector. The magazine further lionized Ridge for his, quote, prominent Buzz Lightyear jaw, which the magazine said gave him the right appearance for a director of Homeland Security. Now, the new post-9/11 American man was said to be a red meat eater. A Washington Post article declared that thanks to 9/11, we were, quote, heading back into a time when real men bring home the bacon and their women cook it up. Rudy Giuliani was described in Newsweek as a man who, quote, ate meats that sweat. And as opposed to the meats that use deodorant, I guess. And when cabinet members gathered at Camp David right after the attacks, much was made of the fact that they dined on what was billed as a Wild West menu of buffalo meat. All these stories were characterized by one nationally syndicated columnist this way. So long, sissy boys. Goodbye, sensitive man. After 30 years of wimpifying its men, turning us all into spit-shine, dough-balled, egg-headed girly boys who can clip a cuticle, manly men are back in vogue. Guys who are not afraid to get their hands dirty and who don't necessarily worry about washing them before eating a liverwurst and onion sandwich. And this is the model of manhood women were swooning to date after 9/11, according to the newspapers. On television, the new manly man wasn't just a hunky firefighter. Increasingly, he was a violent vigilante. A study by the group Human Rights First found that acts of torture on primetime television went from less than 4 a year before 9/11 to more than 100. And the torturers, who in the past were almost entirely the villains, were now so often the show's heroes. These were heroes emulated ultimately by so many U.S. soldiers in Iraq that the military brass paid a call to the producers of the show 24 to ask them to please lay off the exaltation of torture. And then there was the Duke. There were all these media salutes to the so-called return of John Wayne. TV networks began running endless reruns of John Wayne westerns. And the recording industry even reissued John Wayne's America, Why I Love Her, with the Duke reciting patriotic speeches and the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, some of this, although not all of it, may sound odd but relatively harmless. If it weren't for the fact that it took over our public life, starting with our presidential politics. Look at the 2004 presidential campaign, where the candidates seemed to be competing for the title of Davy Crockett in chief. They were bragging about their gun collections, hacking away at sagebrush and tree stumps. You probably remember John Kerry out there shooting wild animals every other weekend and waving the bloody pelts at journalists and describing how he guts doves and tracks deer by crawling on his belly. An unusual way to go after deer, but anyway. When the candidates weren't loading and locking, they were vowing to protect mothers and their children from supposed marauding terrorists in the suburbs. Bush announced that he was guarding us from enemies who would, quote, strike our homes. And Kerry said he would fight terrorism because it was, quote, my sacred duty to protect the bond between a mother and child. So here we have all the elements of the myth: the strong, inflated man, the women cowering back at the homestead. All that's missing is the rescue of the girl, preferably one in danger of being violated. And that's where the Jessica Lynch story comes in, a story that agitated our culture for months on end. Now you remember how the story went. Supposedly special ops teams waged a fierce battle to get into an Iraqi hospital after midnight to rescue Lynch from bloodthirsty Fedayeen death squads who, it was insinuated without evidence, may have raped her. In reality, there was no fight. There were no death squads, which the military knew ahead of time. It was just a bunch of doctors and nurses who were trying to take care of her and who actually were trying to return her to the military. 2 days earlier, they had bundled her into an ambulance and tried to bring her back to the U.S. forces. And had to turn around when they hit a checkpoint where American soldiers were shooting at them so fiercely they couldn't continue on. And Lynch herself said she has no memory. I interviewed her for the book. No memory of being raped. Doesn't believe it happened, and resented the story being out there. But that story of the daring raid and the helpless rescued girl was very important to us as a culture. Now, there was a certain amount of debunking of the Jessica Lynch story over whether she fired her gun or not, whether she was brave or not. The media was very eager to deep six the possibility that, or the story that she might have been shooting. But there's one element that hasn't been analyzed, and that's the transformation of a soldier who enlisted not once but twice into a delicate little maiden. And I thought I'd just read you just a few paragraphs from my book that describe how the media remade her. I just marked so many passages here now. We cast our male soldiers returning from the war zone as battle-tested, seasoned, tougher, old beyond their years. But the post-war Jessica Lynch would be lauded not for her hard-won maturity, but for having remained a girl. Her virtue lay in her preserved and aspic innocence. She hasn't changed one bit, a typical media report assured, after consulting with her kindergarten teacher. The celebration of her perpetual childhood began immediately with media accounts from the military hospital in Germany that described her as, quote, the tiny girl and, quote, the blonde waif. She was said to be, quote, clutching a teddy bear. She was said to favor applesauce and steamed carrots. She was said to be dreaming of washing her hair and styling it with a curling iron. She was said to be, quote, asking for her mother. Stateside, reporters flocked to Palestine, West Virginia, to harvest sugar and spice details from kindergarten teachers and grade school playmates. Her grandmother, the media reported, called her, quote, precious little Jessie. Little Jessie was, according to various dispatches, a, quote, princess laying out her clothes every night, a wannabe beauty queen who liked her hair ribbons to match her outfits, and a little girl who loved pink dresses and perfect hair. We learned that she once fractured her arm and insisted on a pink cast to go with her pink shoelaces. And she presided at the Work County Fair's miscongeniality, quote, couldn't hit the ball at all in softball, wore small-waisted dresses, and was, quote, every mother's dream of a teenager daughter. When the former New York Times reporter Rick Bragg sat down some months later to write his biography on Lynch, called I Am a Soldier Too, he dedicated a chapter titled Princess to the enumeration of her maidenly attributes. The chapter's first sentence is, her bags were always perfect. The biography of a good girl follows. She was born, quote, tiny and beautiful, a, quote, doll-like little girl who was, quote, almost as quiet as one and, quote, never any trouble. Quote, she cried her first day or so in Linda Davies' kindergarten class because she missed her mom. In middle school, she was a cheerleader in little pleated skirts. Even while playing school sports, she was always perfectly made up. As Miss Congeniality, she was, quote, radiant in her burgundy form-hugging gown. In other words, the princess belonged in beauty pageants, not boot camp. Her fatigue swallowed her like a big frog, Rick Bragg wrote. She looked like a child who had sneaked into her daddy's closet and tried on his uniform to play soldier. I Am a Soldier Too seemed an ironic title for a book dedicated to proving the opposite. Now you could see these rescue fantasies playing out in all kinds of ways, like the famous $17 million ad that featured Bush giving a protective hug to a girl whose mother had died in the World Trade Center, in which the girl is quoted as saying, he's the most powerful man in the world, and all he wants to do is make sure I'm safe. Or take the invention of the mythical security mom who supposedly was desperate for a presidential sheriff to guard her and her children. Or in all the rhetoric about how we were going to rescue Afghani women from their burqas and save Iraqi women from Saddam Hussein's rape rooms. It would be one thing if we just invoked these fantasies to get us through a hard time. But our leaders use these fantasies as a substitute for crucial action. Look at how the New York City firefighters were expected to settle for hero worship in the place of the working radios, safety equipment, and the economic support they needed and had begged for in order to be effective heroes. Or the 9/11 widows, who got denounced the minute they quit playing helpless homemaker victim and began to push the government for an accounting of the decisions and failures and missteps leading up to 9/11. There are real consequences to acting according to a made-up script, and real people paid them. America as a whole has suffered. Instead of an actual effort to improve national security and hone a working military strategy, we've been fed adolescent fantasies about missions accomplished and Amber Alerts and evildoers crushed. Living in a myth cleared the way for the erosion of civil liberties and government endorsements of torture. It led us into a misbegotten war against the people who did not attack us and crippled our fight against those who did. And back home, it closed the door on badly needed introspection and insight. Here we are now, 6 years out from the attacks. If the polls on public attitudes toward Bush's performance and the Iraq War are any indication, we as a people may finally be ready to begin asking some hard questions about our response to 9/11. And in that regard, as troubling as all this is, we also live at what could be a moment of possibility. By putting us through a trauma, much like the original trauma that produced our national myth, the attacks on 9/11 present us with a historic opportunity to revisit that past and reverse that long denial, to resolve the old story in a new way that honors the country and its true history, to see ourselves and our frailties in a realistic light instead of papering them over with buckskin bravado and dangerous delusions. I want to thank you very much for listening.
Didn't sit at all well. Didn't sit at all. It presented a very bad image of the United States. And another commentator, I think it's Psyche, Newsweek, suggested that something that could help rehabilitate us would be if a woman or a black were elected president. Preferably both, I guess. So I don't know. I just wondered, do you think we've come far enough that that's even a possibility?
Well, next year we'll tell that tale. But I do think that, you look at the Democratic side, and we, finally have some candidates who reflect the real America. And we may be in a position to actually have an honest discussion about race and class and sex. On the other hand, you look at the, and we have Hillary Clinton saying, as she said in California when she was there a few weeks ago at a rally, that if you elect me, I will put an end to cowboy diplomacy. But, on the other hand, we have Rudy Giuliani as the leading candidate on the GOP slate, and riding and playing the 9/11 rider to the rescue. So what we're in this period where we seem to be turning away from the mythology, but it's a partial turn. And the problem is that, this mythology never goes away. It just goes underground. As far as women are concerned, I feel like all my life I've just, observed women in this country make great strides only to hit up against that wall of resistance. And that wall that force is this cultural reflex that came to the fore after 9/11, became visible. And because it's visible, this is a moment when we could actually be diagnosing it, talking about it, maybe even challenging it. But that's whether that will happen or not is still very much an open question.
Susan, we need you to repeat the questions for the
podcast. I'm sorry.
Just
briefly,
thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Returning briefly to the ballad of Jessica Lynch, reluctantly putting aside a lot of questions about racism, which I know people can solve in my lifetime. What do you think that story would have been if Jessica Lynch had been an average-looking, perhaps a little bit overweight white girl? If she hadn't been this little slip of a blonde cheerleader, what do you think the story would have been then?
Right. The question is, what do I think that the Jessica Lynch ballad would have been like if she wasn't this little slip of a girl, but she was a overweight, slightly overweight, sorry. Regular looking girl, but what we call overweight, which in America, which is over 4 pounds. Well, there is a real answer to that. And you say slightly overweight white girl, but let's say she, forget about her weight, you say she was not a white girl, but a black girl or a Native American girl. And let's also say women, since none of these soldiers were actually girls. And in the case of the ambush of Jessica Lynch's unit, the story that got dropped out, well, 2 stories that got dropped out. The first story was there were 5 members of the unit who were actually taken captive, were taken hostage. And one of them was Shoshana Johnson, who's black. And she and the 4 others were, it was a very humiliating scene for us where they were traced out on Al Jazeera and on Iraqi television. It was a sort of a return to those rescue attempts that it's not clear if they're going to work out. The story of how they were rescued is interestingly very undercovered. I could only find 2 articles on it, and it was because it was not exactly a story of our daring do. There was a group of Marines that were dispatched to go get them. They were their captors at the time had enough of holding them hostage, and so it actually contacted the Marines and said, "Here's the address where they are. Please come pick them up." And this unit came to they found the street after much trouble, and then couldn't figure out what the right address was, and finally one of the hostages sort of leaned out the window and yelled, "We're over here, please come get us." But this story depends on the rescue of a young white woman. So nobody, even if the story had been a dramatic rescue tale, it's unlikely that Shoshana Johnson would have become this, poster child on the cover of People magazine. The other story is when the Jessica Lynch she kept saying, the hero of this story is Lori Piastua. And Lori Piastua was a 23-year-old Hopi Indian single mom who had been at Fort Bliss with Jessica Lynch, and insisted on going with her unit to Iraq, even though she had been injured in a training exercise right before and was actually excused from deployment. But she said, no, if my comrade in arms is going, I'm going. And she was also the one who, in the mad dash to Baghdad, when Jessica Lynch's truck broke down and she was stranded at the side of the road, and vehicle after vehicle whizzed by her without stopping. It was Lori Piastua who stopped and picked her up, and it was ultimately Lori Piastua who died in the car wreck that ensued, even though she had a chance to swap cars out to swap with another driver, but she said, no, I'm sticking with my unit. The media made light mention of her, but did not focus on her with the intensity, to say the least, that they did with Jessica Lynch. And I could only find one really major profile done of Lori Piastua in the mainstream media, and it ran almost a year after the ambush in Rolling Stone, and it was aptly titled "The Forgotten Soldier."
First of all, thank you very much for a wonderful book, I think, and the courage you take to discuss subjects like this. My question is it enough to try to highlight the feminine versus the male dominance story, or is it just the simplicity that our politicians and our media try to push to us by saying evil versus good, hero versus little girl, all this kind of stuff? Is it part of the big picture of simplifying everything because we're dumb enough that we need this kind of simplification?
To everyone here, I think you've got.
I think I'm
the question of is the gender dimension, is that just something that politicians are forcing down our throats because we like that simplicity. Well, but when you go back and look at the earliest history, what you see over and over again is not just heroes and victims. It's a particular kind of male hero and a particular kind of female victim. That we run this through the gender filter, and that the sort of drama between the sexes is really at the bedrock. You look at after 9/11, what the sort of heroes and victims story we enacted. If you consider the catastrophic event itself, it didn't lend itself to male hero, female victim drama. For one thing, the casualties were 3-to-1 male to female. If you were in the towers and above the fire line, you were instantly killed, which 95% of the people who died there, that was the situation. And if you were below, you basically, unless you were in a wheelchair or infirm, you walked out on your own 2 feet. So there were few opportunities for rescue, and certainly in the planes there were none. And yet we created out of sort of whole cloth this story of where we designated the heroes, the men who died, who were victims, basically the firefighters, and some of their fellow surviving firefighters, but not the female firefighters or the female responders who sort of dropped out of the picture. If you go back to the media, suddenly firefighters become firemen and police officers become policemen. This was so notable to women who were paying attention that a women's rights group decided to create just this very, very short film recognizing the women of Ground Zero, the first responders who, female first responders who had been courageous and risked their lives and had, run into the buildings. And the film is shown in a very few places, and it immediately prompted this infuriated attack in the media. The Washington Post suggested that now Legal Defense Fund, which had funded the film, was trying to take money away from the families of the victims, take federal money away and use it on to support affirmative action of women in the rebuilding of Ground Zero. A complete fabrication, and yet as many times as they tried to correct it, it became the favorite media myth that was circulated constantly. And then on the other side, in the absence of female victims, we created, in the media, created, or just designated the widows, the 9/11 widows, as the victims. So even where we didn't have a situation where it really divided up male and female, and it wasn't just the politicians who were doing this, the media, the popular culture, movies. You think of Oliver Stone's World Trade Center, where he created a sort of all-male world of Ground Zero, and the women were all the sort of worried wives and relatives at home.
Wouldn't a truly pluralistic society honor both?
I'm sorry, I missed the
Wouldn't
first.
a truly pluralistic society honor both non-conforming males and non-conforming females who do not feel compelled to respond to events in heroic ways that are traditionally associated with patriarchal values?
You would think so. The question is, wouldn't a pluralistic society honor non-conforming males and non-conforming females? Wouldn't it be nice? But I think, as a culture, we've also sort of recoiled from our pluralism and our diversity by employing fantasy images that return us to some kind of cut and dry certainty where everyone knows their role. Freedom is frightening and defining yourself without the cartoon paint by number guide is terrifying for a lot of people. They don't want it.
But to resist this idea of what men and women should be sets oneself up to be viewed as repulsive to the majority of people. Even men and women of the left who consider themselves above those kinds of attitudes.
Right. Which is why, feminists, the first thing that's said about them is that they're not they're sort of abnormal as women, that there's something wrong with their femininity. And that's always the line of attack.
But I've never seen an article in Ms. Applauding cowardice.
Well, I women and men both can be courageous. I'm not sure that you want to.
But like I'm saying, a truly pluralistic society would see that cowardly people are just another variant of the human condition.
Yeah,
and that we deserve a place at the table too.
Yeah. Other than the cowardly lion in Wizard of Oz, the bogies loved and identified with. Anyone else? Yeah.
We read a number of books over the years that talks about the lives of women, Muslim women in the Arab countries, and regarding disregarding their level of education and profession, how their lives are restricted, and the more radical that their society becomes, the more restrictions that are placed on these women, and
this in great detail in the book. The comment was about how this irony of where we were supposedly riding to the rescue of Afghani women, freeing them from their burqas, so we seem to be doing the opposite back at home, and that was certainly the case. I mean, after 9/11, the government ditched long-standing sex discrimination suits, quietly attempted at least to roll back some of women's advances in the military. And certainly the exaltation of the security mom was another example of that. Right after 9/11, in the ramp up to the war in Afghanistan, the Bush administration suddenly phoned all these women's rights leaders who had been utterly, iced out from inauguration on, and what do you know? Suddenly they were being invited to the White House and the State Department, and a grand show was put on about how we care about women's liberation in Afghanistan. And we all remember Laura Bush being on the radio saying she was going to kick off a worldwide effort to emancipate women, which, judging by her talk, mostly involved allowing women to wear lipstick and children to fly kites, which I didn't know was on the top of the feminist agenda. But soon after the invasion, like 2 weeks after, you could see in the media Bush officials, when asked about what about this women's rights guarantees, equal rights, women represented in the new government, et cetera. The answer was, well, we have other, quote, we have other priorities now. We don't want to impose our values on these people. So it was quickly abandoned, and it was never really about women's liberation. It was about appealing to our desire to rescue. It was a story of chivalry more than a story of emancipation.
Susan, I think we have time for one or two questions. Let's go there.
Yes.
In your second book, Skip, you wrote about how a Davy Crockett mentality took hold with the help of Disney and Coonskin Caps back in 1955. In that sense, is the post-9/11 response just business as usual, with we blow an opportunity to get back to this Daniel Boone home and heart approach that you also wrote about?
Right. Did everyone hear in Skipped, my second book, I wrote about the sort of Davy Crockett fixation, and we all, well, some of us older people remember the Davy Crockett, sort of coonskin cap craze in the 50s. And the question is this a return? So in that way, is it just business as usual? Well, this mythology I'm describing is one that is always there, lying beneath the surface, but it gets reactivated in particular times of crisis when we feel threatened in our, on our home soil. So I agonized about this a lot at the beginning. Well, why did we return to this sort of 1950s mode after 9/11? If we're in wartime, shouldn't we be returning to 1940s mode? As much as the media originally, the first few weeks was saying, well, maybe this will be our new day of infamy, and this will be the baby boom's greatest generation. It didn't play out that way at all. And quickly the media retreated to this John Wayne, Doris Day kind of fantasy. But what I finally came to was that actually the end of World War II and the 50s could be seen as a return to that original fear, because what happened at the end of World War II? We dropped the bomb. We had invented guided missiles and long-range bombers, If you go back and read the press in those months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki and throughout the period of the 50s, of the anxieties over entering the atomic age, what you see over and over again are discussions about, we're no longer protected on our home soil. We are open to, we're no longer the isolated continent. Anybody can come now and penetrate us and violate us. So you see a sort of reprise of this drama. The Bush administration couldn't have done any of this without the collaboration of the media, of our whole, of our culture, and when you go back and look at the kind of cooperation, to put it nicely, that the press was engaged in that period. I mean, you see mainstream journalists, commentators endorsing in the months after 9/11, saying we need to consider torture, saying, and this is in Newsweek and the Washington Post and Atlantic Monthly, talking about we need to think about secret prisons. We need to think about what became extraordinary rendition. So this was not, as much as the press now likes to sort of hold the Bush administration at arm's length, it was a real dance, and our culture at large participated in it. And if we're ever to turn this around, what we desperately need is the counter to this commercialized media / entertainment culture, which is a civic society that has discussions like this in public venues and creates or revives public channels for making real change instead of the sort of passive consumer culture we have now. Thank you very much. Yes, change what you did. This child separate her from petrol shoe of time even in an illegal place with me and responsibility and terrible officer and the teacher I was behind the company over and the possible way to she said it was a big quote it's changing penny her. She was to say give her fit up her just to keep her hair. She was to say she be doing one of her share hamstring and while with him she was to say quote asking for it's days on her sport loss to stall with under just part of the advice for details as regarding teenagers were it's meet the review for all cover her little what words to be very great that is she was printness let's her close there like her to minister and flowers and so little pink express